A photograph captures a moment in time. You don't have to do anything special for this to happen. It's part of the nature of the camera to be able to freeze this moment. It does it quite spontaneously. And because of the nature of the world to change and move on, these moments can never be revisited. To take a photograph means that you have to be there. It's a bit different from journalism, where a reporter can come in to where an incident has happened, say, and then reconstruct through interviews an account of what happened. Photography isn't like that. You can't really reconstruct a photograph. So you have to be there at the moment. I came from Brisbane to Sydney in the late 60s, 1969. Actually, the Opera House wasn't built there. Someone has pointed out, but that's a generic photograph of Sydney. I'd studied architecture at Queensland University, and I went to Sydney to do a theatre set, and I looked like this. I found that I joined up with an experimental theatre group, but I found that I couldn't make a living from being a playwright, so I turned to photography. And since I was always surrounded by actors, there was one point where I just decided that I'd become a freelance photographer. And since I was surrounded by actors, I began by taking photographs of actors' portfolios, actors for their portfolios, because they always needed photographs, actors. And that's a photograph of the actor Gillian Jones. And I found that photography was a better medium to make money in than writing for me. And so I found that I could pay the rent. I met the wonderful dynamic fashion duo, Jenny Key and Linda Jackson. They had fabulous parades. They had the label Flamingo Park. And they were very successful. They were doing their thing, and they weren't part of the mainstream, and they were an inspiration for me. That's Jenny used to design. Jenny had this shop at the Strand Arcade, and Linda used to design the fabrics, although Jenny did some of her own designs later. Jenny was half Chinese, half Australian, but she, like me, we were very assimilated into the Australian way of life and didn't think of ourselves as Chinese. I tried my hand at fashion, and while this is quite a good photograph, it was taken at one of Jenny and Linda's parades, I found that I was terrible at fashion. For fashion, you need to have a concept of beautiful women. I had none. For fashion, you need to be able to cover up the flaws. My natural tendency was to expose them. I found that I was better at party and events. The arena suited me. It was more theatrical. And even as a writer, I'd always thought that real life threw up better situations than you could think of yourself. This is one of a party at Madame Lash's. It was her rack party in the 70s. and this is another party. The person on the right is an actor called Jack, who was also known as the Incredible Orlando, and he was part of the Lindsay Kemp troupe, and he was also blind, so there's a certain irony in this photograph. So that's how I earned my living in the 70s. I took photographs of 70s and the early 80s, where I took photographs of celebrities, and I would go to openings and events, parties, parades, and my photographs were published in Mode magazine in the social pages. And it was through this style of photography, because I was going out all the time and you meet people, and then I was able to meet celebrities and take their photographs. It was sort of like another step that I could take, contacts with celebrities. And this is Mel Gibson in 1980, I think it is, before he was famous. And this is a photograph of Blanche Delpuget. There were two. This is sort of different from that last photograph, you may notice, in that this photograph was taken with studio lighting. I took it to her place and set it up. So there's two ways you can take a photograph. Either you can do studio. There are two different styles, let's say. There's studio photography, where you've got an extremely controlled lighting situation, because that's what photographers want. They want lighting control. And it means then that you can get the exact result that you want within a studio. And so what happens is you set up a studio with the perfect lighting conditions, and you bring your subjects into your world. Now, this has the advantage of that it's very controlled, and you can be almost 99% sure that you're going to get the technical photograph that you want. But it has the disadvantage that it's just a little bit sterile. And because you're working in studios, the backgrounds, I think, are a little bit sterile. Whereas this photograph, which was the style that I evolved to, which is taking your photographs on the site, as it were, in different situations where there are other forces at play. In fact, this was taken on a movie set. In fact, you don't have a lot of control over what you're getting, or even access to the subject. But you can get a livelier product. And so this is a very intense photograph of Judy Davis, which would be very difficult to manufacture in a studio. Patrick White, I had a friendship with Patrick White over the last 14 years of his life, and I've brought out a book called Patrick White, The Late Years. And I was introduced to Patrick White by Jim Sharman, and so I was able to have access to him because he wasn't friendly towards journalism. I mean, that's a general thing. But during the last years of his life, he did plays. Jim produced his plays, and he would say, for the actors, I'll allow myself to be interviewed by journalists, and allow myself to have my photograph taken for the sake of the actors in the play, because they do need publicity. And so that was how I often got a photograph of Patrick White. He'd allow himself to be photographed. But later, when we became more friendly, I took other photographs of him, not necessarily in that situation. Here's a photograph of David Moore, the photographer. Taken in a working situation. So it's as close as you could get to a candid photograph. And this is David Goppell. He's quite young, probably was teenager, and I took it at a street festival in Paddington, and so it was quite a lively environment. Although I think that probably David Goppell could reproduce that smile in a studio situation, just because of his personality. I also photographed the gay community, which was emerging in the 70s, and I photographed the gay community for the 30 years that I've been in Sydney. So I've been able to photograph the complete modern gay movement, as it were, in Sydney, and it's probably my biggest and most complete portfolio. Of course, the gay profile now is, which is the actual community, has gone on for over 30 years, and its main flagship is the Mardi Gras in Sydney, which used to be called the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, and that's been on television. And now the community has got quite a high profile, and it's just go back to this one. It's got quite a lot of exposure, but I thought that the most valuable photographs that I've got of the community is in the 70s. The photographs that I took in the 70s, where not very many people were photographing it. And later I began to write on my works, and this is about an encounter I had with a deaf person. I didn't start writing on my photographs till the 90s, but that's when I started to do performance pieces. But then I went back to my older photographs, and in fact I like these photographs that I took here of people who I'd met. This one's called "Do You Remember Me? I slept beside you but left in the morning." And when I took these photographs, I never showed them till about 10 years later, and I don't know, I just didn't think, because I was doing with celebrities, I thought that these personal, intimate photographs were of no value. But now I think they're some of my best photographs. More documentation. This is in the 80s in Sydney, the Darlinghurst area, where there was a gay ghetto growing up at the time, and gay men found that they could live in a gay environment, work in Oxford Street and fraternise without having to have anything to do with the straight world at all. And this situation had never happened before in Sydney. This is Peter Tully. This is the Mardi Gras in 1982. This was the beginning of the Sydney Gay Mardi Gras, as it was called then. And it began in 1978 as a street march where people were arrested. So it was a demonstration, and that marked the first Mardi Gras event. And for about 3 or 4 years, it was like a street march. But in 1982, Peter Tully worked to change it from a demonstration to more of a fun event. And it quickly grew in the early 80s and mid-80s to the prototype of the modern Mardi Gras. And so I just think that the mid-80s was the golden age of the Mardi Gras. And there was a lot of abstraction and art in it then. This is a photograph of my paternal grandfather, R. Young. He came from the south of China in the 1880s to the Palmer River goldfields near Cooktown. He looked for gold, and gold ran out. He drifted south, and he had shares in a cane farm near Cairns. He sent back to China. He brought out a wife, and they had one child, Charlie Young. The wife, Kwong Di, died when Charlie was a boy, and Charlie was brought up by the men on the cane farm, and sometimes he was boarded out to different families. And in the 1930s, Charlie had a shop at a place called Aloomba, just south of Cairns. He played saxophone in a dance band. He had a car, and he would sometimes travel to Cairns to buy supplies for the shop. He had a social life in Cairns. Here's the Chinese National Club in Cairns in the 1930s. They were supporters of Chiang Kai-shek, and they would sometimes have fundraisers for Chiang Kai-shek for his war effort against the Japanese in China. Probably at one of those functions, my father met my mother, Emma Wing. My mother was born in the Northern Territory, and she had come over. Well, her family history is similar. I'll just see if I've got a shot of her mother. Yes, here we are. Her mother, Ang Si, had come over. Well, her father, Chun Wing, had come over. I don't have a photograph of Chun Wing. He'd come over also in the 1880s to the goldfields in the Northern Territory, Yam Creek. He was a school teacher back in China. When he established himself in the Northern Territory, he sent back to China and he brought out Ang Si. She came from the Siyap village in China. She couldn't speak English, and she came to the primitive gold mining town. They had 4 children. Chun Wing, because he was educated and could read and write Chinese, could do accounts, and he had a shop, and he must have been fairly successful because they arranged a marriage between the eldest daughter, Bessie, to William Fang Yuan, the rich landowner from the east coast of Australia. He had cane farms and a shop, and Bessie was 16, Chun Wing was about 40 when they married, and the whole family came from the Northern Territory to a place called Marillion near Innisfail to live under Fang Yuan's roof, Chinese style, and Chun Wing was going to do Fang Yuan's books for him. So that's how my mother's family came to be living in North Queensland. Now, Chunwing and Bessie had 4 children, but Fang Yuan was murdered in the 1920s by a white Russian called Peter Danilchenko. This is a police diagram of the murder. People knew that Peter Danilchenko, who was a manager on one of Fang Yuan's farms, had shot him. But what happened was Peter Danilchenko was acquitted of willful murder at a trial in Innisfail, and the Chinese at the time were very upset about the outcome of that trial because they felt that there had been a miscarriage of justice. So I wrote about that story as the central story in a piece called Sadness, which I did in 1992. There were 2 stories. There was a story about people in the gay community in Sydney dying of AIDS, and also a story about my Chinese family in North Queensland, which alluded to a history of the Chinese in Australia. And it was also centred around the murder of my uncle in 1922. And so by now, I had done gallery exhibitions. This is 1992. I first started doing photography in 1974. I'll just have to backtrack now and explain that in the 80s, I started doing slide projection and performance pieces in the theatre. And they were successful for me right from the very first one I did in 1988. And so in 1992, I did my 3rd performance piece called Sadness, and it was very successful for me, and it toured all around Australia, and it toured to overseas as well. And this was the first time I'd ever had work of a certain volume that toured overseas. I mean, I took it to the London International Festival of Theatre in 1993, I think, if it wasn't 94. And so that was the beginning of international exposure for me. This is me doing an actual performance of Sadness. So it's not entirely unlike what I'm doing now, which is talking with slide projection. But it is slightly different when it is in a theatre, and there's a different attention, and there's music, and there's a story. Because I'm just talking about a whole lot of things now, but when I'm doing one of my performance pieces, it's usually about a certain subject. So when I talked about my family in Australia, I also have to backtrack now and tell you a bit about about myself and my ethnicity, because as I've told you, my grandparents came out here in the 1880s, and so I call myself 3rd generation Australian-born Chinese. My mother had wanted us to be Western. She'd brought us up in the Western way, and she wanted us to be Australian, and so the Chinese side was denied and unacknowledged. But it wasn't all my mother's fault, because it was partly cultural as well. Australians at that time, when I grew up in the 1950s, had wanted people to assimilate. They wanted people to speak English. They wanted people to be Australian. If you spoke a foreign language, you were mocked. So I grew up with the Chinese side denied and unacknowledged. And I tell this anecdote I've got this fabulous encapsulation of that, which I remember from my childhood. When I was about 6 years old, one of the kids at school called me Ching Chong Chinaman, born in a jar, christened in a teapot, ha ha ha. I had no idea what he was talking about, although I knew from his expression that he was being horrible to me. So I went home to my mother and I said, "Mum, I'm not Chinese, am I?" And my mother looked at me very sternly and she said, "Yes, you are." Her tone was hard and it shocked me. And I knew in that moment that being Chinese was like a terrible curse, and I could not rely on my mother for help, or my brother, who was 4 years older, very much more experienced in the world. He chimed in, "And you'd better get used to it." So I went on to, after Sadness, I did another piece which was called The North, which is about my childhood growing up in North Queensland. And so I was able to talk about all those issues. And The North was also very successful for me as a performance piece. I first did it, I think, mid-90s. And it wasn't a great piece like Sadness is a great piece, but it climbed up on the back of Sadness. And somehow as an artist, I've discovered that you just have to keep on doing new things, and sometimes they're better or worse, however they turn out. And but you just have to keep churning it out, and so you just have to keep doing things. You can't actually rest on your laurels for a second, otherwise people will forget you. That's the nature of art. This is my family in Dimbula, where we grew up. This is a rare photograph. Yes, it's one of the few photographs that exists of that time of us as a family. It's my brother Alan, who was attending the boarding school at Herberton. My sister Frances, who was a nurse at Mareeba Hospital. I was about to go to high school in Cairns, and that's my father and my mother at the tobacco farm in Dimbula. So besides telling my own personal story, I suppose one thing leads to another, because the ABC commissioned me to do a research on a mini-series they were doing about the Chinese into Australia. And I travelled around Australia visiting places where the Chinese had been. That's the burning towers at Beechworth, at the Chinese cemetery there. And this is the Chinese mining shaft at Pine Creek in the Northern Territory. So that still exists. And this is Yam Creek, where my grandfather came, is nearby. So it is all part of my personal history. These Broome in Western Australia, which has a Chinatown in its original condition. It's the only place in Australia where something like this still exists. They told me that it's just like the big Chinatown in Darwin was before the war. This is World War II, before it was destroyed by the Japanese bombs. So this is all part of a history. I also photographed people. This is in my travels around Australia. That's Madeline and Eileen Nomchong from Braidwood. They were a big Chinese family in Braidwood. There were 13 children in the family, and these are the last two surviving daughters. and in fact, I took this photograph in 1990, and both Eileen and Madeline have passed on. In Young Museum, I discovered the No Chinese flag, which I'd read about in many accounts. There was a goldfield at Lambing Flats, which is near Young, and there the Chinese were driven from the goldfields by the gold diggers, and it's a famous incident in Australian history. And I had no idea that this flag was going to be in the museum, but so I was really quite surprised and amazed to see this flag there. And in that moment, history became vivid and alive for me. Everything that I'd been researching suddenly became alive and tangible. And I think that that's something, it's a sort of discovery that archaeologists go through, where they're digging around and so they find something that's very old, and sometimes something triggers off in you everything, because you've got something tangible in your hand, everything that you know about the subject somehow comes to life. That's just one of the experiences I had there. I also had that experience when I found those documents about William Thane Nguyen's murder in the courthouse at Innisfail. So I suppose you could say that after I went through all this identification, claiming my Chinese heritage, I worked out who I was. I worked out my identity, which is it's a bicultural identity. It's Australian predominantly, but I can claim my Chinese heritage because of what I was born into, or my biological heritage. And so those years were very big on working out who I was. And as a parallel process, I also took a lot of photographs of nature, and nature was also, I realized, part of my identity. This is a photograph of the country, I call it the country round in Beulah. This is where I grew up. This is the country that I remember from my childhood. And this is a photograph of Chillagoe, which is in the same area, a sort of drier country. And I'd never been to Chillagoe, but when I went there, it seemed to me that this was the country that I remembered from my childhood. So I realized that identification of home is very much tied in with the landscape, especially in Australia, because Australia does have a landscape. Many countries of the world, let's say Europe, let's say China, everything is so developed that there's very little natural country left. And at least in Australia there is some natural country, and I think a lot of people would identify landscape as part of their identification of home or being Australian. So I claim that area in North Queensland as my own special landscape, but I also photograph Australian landscape. I have since the 80s, and this is a very beautiful patch of country in Western Australia, in the south-western area of Western Australia, and it's in a forest. This is in Gonia in Western New South Wales. Now I just suddenly realised I'm starting to run out of time, so maybe I should talk faster. Oh no! Wait a minute! I've got my watch upside down. No, we're on time. Okay, I needn't skip over this. I met up with a Indigenous community at Ingonia in the 1990s through George and Gabriel Gittos. George is the artist, who's a very good friend of mine, and they had adopted an Aboriginal boy called Falla Shillingsworth. That's Falla on the right, and that's a person called Granny, his great-grandmother. They'd adopted Falla in the Aboriginal sense of the word, like they became like his foster parents. Falla didn't have to give up his biological mother, and so George and Gabriel are very supportive of the whole community at Ingonia, and I could go there more or less as family. And that's Falla's grandmother, Ruby Yulo, and she had brought Falla up. Falla's mother, Irene, had been unable to bring him up, so Ruby had brought him up, and Falla regards Ruby as his mother. That's Falla's brother Bruce, who married Trish, and they had the shop at Ingonia. This was, we went on a hunt. The animals in the wire cage are hunting dogs, and they had rifles. And I suppose what I like most being with Indigenous communities is that they've got a very strong connection with the land, and so you just feel much more connected with nature when you're with them. That's Falla's brother and sister, Sam and Judy, both of whom were alcoholic, charming people, but the whole community was really devastated by alcoholism, and it was really quite depressing, and still is, to actually experience something like that firsthand. Massacre, which the community had told me about, and so this is human remains at the site of a massacre. That's the skeleton of a child's hand, and when I came across this, I felt that I had found a key to their not a solution, just a key to their dispossession. And I've done a piece about this Ingonia community are in a piece of my latest piece called Shadows, which I'd run out of my own family stories, so it had an Indigenous story, and so I've used this photograph and the story of the community in Shadows. So just jumping into the future now, just picking up as a documentary photographer, ideal in fact, I suppose, and that communities change, and this is the in the 90s, our Asian, lesbian and gay pride group used to have New Year's Eve parties in the Chinese gardens as part of Mardi Gras cultural festival. And this is a publicity photograph for the Year of the Snake. So communities have their own evolution. This is a poster I did for ACON, that's the AIDS Council of New South Wales, with it's targeting gay Asian men. And I can't quite get this to focus, but it says, "Please don't put me in your exhibition. I still live at home. Nobody knows about me. Put Norman in. He likes that sort of thing. I'm not ready yet." So I call this one invisibility number 2. And so I suppose it's about within communities, there are subsections of communities. And for example, the gay Asian part of the general Sydney gay and lesbian, bisexual and transgender scene is different from the mainstream scene in that because it's culturally different, it's harder for gay Asians to come out and to have a sort of outgoing cultural identity like Western gay people. This is a photograph of the artist David Mcdermott during the last years of his life. David had AIDS, and this is all part of that piece I did called Sadness, which was about loss. So, this is a little section about AIDS. That's Brendan Heath Kerr, who was a performance artist, and he did a bodysuit, which was a latex cast of his own body, which he wore over on his own body, and he did this performance at an exhibition called "Don't Leave Me This Way, Art in the Age of AIDS" at the exhibition in Canberra in about 1998. A vigil. In the early 90s, many people from the Sydney community died of AIDS, and there were vigils which were like expressions, community expressions of a common grief. They don't happen so much now, or at least there's not the same number of people dying because of better treatments for the disease. This is Alan, who was a friend of mine, and I documented Alan. It's probably one of my best photographic series. It's this one and About My Mother are probably my 2 best works. So this is Alan, who there's like a progression of 19 photographs of him. And the one thing I'll say about this was that I'd always photographed Alan, and I think that he appreciated the fact that I still photographed him when he was sick, because in fact when you get sick people take less interest in you and people avoid you, and I think that in some ways he appreciated the fact that I didn't lose interest in him. And so this is the work that's in the gallery called About My Mother, and I did this work a few years ago, and it's sort of like revisiting my mother, who died in 1992. So this is like 11 years after my mother died. I did a piece about her where there was a part, because I'm a diarist of my own life, my mother actually comes up in my pieces quite a lot, because she was probably the biggest influence in my life. And there was a period, especially in Brisbane, which never fitted into any of my mainstream stories about the family. And so I was able to write about my mother in Brisbane and put them into this work about my mother. And so I guess as a documentary photographer, I've remained pretty well, I'd still call myself a documentary photographer, although I've defined myself, because I've broadened my base, because I do performance pieces, and documentary photographer is not so fashionable at the moment, because art media photography is more fashionable, and so documentary photographers feel that they've been relegated to the unfashionable heap. And but nevertheless, I still take photographs. I still photograph celebrities. This is David Moore, the photographer. I took this photograph in the year before he died, and that's him with a photograph of himself which he took when he was about 15. This is David Goppell, 2002. He can still bring on that smile, but he's had a hard life, David Goppell. And this is Tony Collette and Rachel Griffiths, just to get a sense that there is new people coming on all the time. There are new celebrities, new people who are favourites, and so it's a never-ending story. This, if you're photographing celebrity. This is my last section, and they're more recent photographs. I felt that I've gone through 3 periods of photography. In my first period, when I was younger and I had more energy, and I ran around a lot, and I photographed Sydney social events, and I had a life going to it was a social life, and probably the photographs of celebrities that I took then are probably still among my most commercial photographs. But then in the second period, I felt that I was able to consolidate certain themes, and the themes were actually marginalized communities. And so I did gay community, I did Australian Chinese, and even the Indigenous community, of which I haven't really got a big body of work on them, but they sort of fit into alternative histories of Australia. And in the last period, which I'm in at the moment, is I've become more reflective, and I just don't race around like I used to, and I suppose that I'm more interested in ordinary things. This is my kitchen at Bondi, where I used to live, and I suppose that it's finding fascination with the ordinary and moving. This one's called. I suppose I'm a diarist of my own life, and my story is very important to me, and it's probably, if I just photograph things that are closest to me, then I feel then they ultimately turn out to be among my best works. I moved from Bondi to Arncliffe recently, so that's a photograph of my living room. I work at home, so I use the space as to spread out. I've got more room than I had at Bondi, and I suppose that I define myself principally as an artist or a photographer, and so I feel best when I'm just working away at my work, and I'm just quite happy to do that now. This is a shrine in my living room. I call myself a Taoist, although I qualify that now and describe myself as a decorative Taoist. By this I mean it's hard to take on a Chinese philosophy when you live in a Western environment, and I'd say I'd be more Taoist if everybody else was. This is a meal I made for myself. I live alone, and I made this meal, and I thought, oh, I must take a photograph of this, and it's more a sort of image of myself. It's more or less like a flattering image of myself, where I'm disciplined and I suppose neat, a lot neater than I am really in real life. But anyway, they're the things, that's the sort of lies you tell about yourself in photographs. I've got to like Arncliffe where I live, and I've got a bicycle and I ride it around it. I discovered some Chinese gardens there. So that was quite exciting to find bits of personal history, or bits of history within the place where I was living that sort of had resonances with me. And this is the last photograph of the series, which is the Cook River, where I also ride my bicycle. And I suppose that this photograph is, I don't know what it's about. I call it ladder. But I suppose that it's how art works for me, where I'm able to break into another realm. And in fact, I can transcend my life in art, and that's a sort of philosophical position that I take. Okay, the end. So we've got 2 minutes if you want to ask me any questions.
A lot of smiling faces out there, but not a whole lot of questions. So I suppose I just want to ask you, you're continuing to do these more reflective photographs. Have you got any major projects that you're working on at the moment, William?
I've reinvented myself in that I've gone digital. And I'm also working in video. And I actually find that there are lots of photographs out there wherever I go, but the difficult thing is, because I have got a busy life, like everybody's got a busy life, and it's hard to motivate yourself to take the photographs. But I have found that since I've got my video camera, that it's just something new for me to play with. And so I found that I've been more keen to actually take the images with different equipment. So yeah, I think that really the trick is motivating yourself to take the photographs, because you can actually get a bit tired as a photographer. And I don't know, it will evolve into something, I guess. It's hard actually to, I'm more or less doing less and less prints, because it's hard to sell a print if you're a documentary photographer. So I'll probably move a bit into video, I think. That's a direction that I still do my performance pieces, and they're still very successful for me. But if I wanted a product for a gallery, I think I might try video.
Good idea. What a good idea. Any questions or comments from the floor over here?
Yeah, William, I just wonder, would you comment on your mother's attitude towards your celebrity?
Pardon?
Would you comment on your mother's attitude towards your celebrity?
My mother was quite a retiring person, and one of the things that she was angry with me when I first wrote a story about the family. And one of the things that she said was that she didn't think that she was worthy of that sort of attention. And probably she felt that our family story was worthless, really. And so I'm not going to carry that with me. I've thrown off that attitude. And in fact, my story is very important to me. And one thing that I also I've got a piece, in one of the pieces I've said, really, I came to, one of the big developments in my relationship was my mother, was I felt that I could never please my mother. I could never live up to whatever she wanted of me, and I'm not even sure what that was. And once I realized that, it was fine, because I just didn't try to please her, and I was just happy about it, and life went on as it always had, and I just didn't have this desire to please her or work subconsciously, oh, I've got to please my mother. That's really a big motive that runs through everybody. And so, yeah. The other thing there's another piece in there that's a bit related to that, is that I felt that I never actually became my own person till after my mother died. Then suddenly I could actually be myself entirely. And that's got nothing to do with my relationship with my mother. I just think that is another step in one's evolution of oneself. And so probably my mother would not have liked the attention, and I just don't think that bothers me anymore. Because it is a homage to her, and people don't like portraits of themselves, as a photographer, is my experience.
There's one more question from Susan.
Wondering whether you have gone back to the source of your family diaspora. Has that been of interest to you?
Well, it was something that was very important to my understanding of myself. And my performance pieces, my 3 performance pieces about my family, are my most successful ones. But what happened, and they're very important for me just to understanding who I am, how I fit into the society in general, what a position is, what it means to be marginalised, all this dominant culture stuff. History is the history of the dominant culture, written by the victors, so it is important to tell marginalised histories. So, but at the same time, I've told by and large, in my 3 performance pieces, I've told my complete family story. I haven't got any more story left. So maybe in 10 years' time I'd have...
More your roots in China?
Yeah, I've been back to China. But the thing is, although I claim China as my cultural heritage, I've been... What is stronger, much stronger, is one's conditioning towards the place where you were born. And so really I am more Australian, although I look Chinese, and although I claim my Chinese ancestry as part of my cultural makeup, I'm really Australian. And that's a thing that you can't, it's very hard to throw off your conditioning. Almost impossible, I'd say.
I'd just like to conclude by thanking William. I think that the last point is a really important one. By investigating his different families and different histories, the families of your friends as well, William has shown us a different way of being Australian. Thank you so much for speaking to us today with your customary generosity and wisdom. Would you all join me in thanking William Yang again?
Thank you.